Hey, thank you for joining my YouTube channel, for listening today, however you're acquiring this fun time together. And I'm super excited that you're with me and we're starting a brand new series. Of course, I want you to subscribe, right? Because we have amazing content here that'll really encourage and help you, give you some relevant stuff to apply in your daily life. And so our new series is called, this is kind of a drum roll here, it's called Tapas with Jesus. Tapas with Jesus. You're like, what are you talking about? Because if you don't pronounce that well, you could get in some hot water, right? You could get in some very hot water. So tapas is like Spanish small plates, little appetizers. And it's a style of eating. It's similar to dim sum, like they have in Hong Kong, little bites, little plates, little pieces. And so it's a meal kind of small plates, or a meal of appetizers, if you will. And I want us to think about what that looks like with Jesus. And you're like, that's kind of an interesting combination. How do you bring those two together? Well, I was thinking about having a meal with Jesus, like dinner with Jesus. I've been doing a series in my church called Table Talk with Jesus. And I thought about this. I was like, it's interesting because when you have a meal, like a regular meal, you have like, in America, we do salad, we'll do like some kind of vegetable, maybe bread or some kind of, carb, I don't know. And then a meat or a casserole, something like that. And we have like more of those bigger servings, if you will, of those respective plates. Whereas tapas is little tiny bites. So you get a wider array of tastes and, maybe textures, some crunchy, some soft, some sweet, some savory, some kind of sweet and sour, so you get this whole blend, and it's a little bit more of a wide spectrum of a meal rather than just a couple of main flavors. And so I think it's interesting to apply this with Jesus, because I think sometimes we can deep dive in one thing, have like a main entree with Jesus, one subject, main topic, and that's good. And I think it's helpful and necessary for us to emphasize some main things, be that healing, be that faith, those are all good. But I would also suggest to you that Jesus, when he lived on the planet, had little bite-sized conversations, right? Little small bites. And some of those were fun, and some of those were sweet, and some of them were a little bit salty. Some of them were a little tangy. But it was interesting to have this cross taste, diversity of conversations, little bites with Jesus. And so that's what this series is about. Tapas with Jesus, little bites. And so the first one I want to briefly talk about with you today is a very interesting conversation in Matthew 15, verses 1-6. And he has a conversation with the religious leaders. They come to him and they ask Jesus, and they say, why do your disciples break the traditions of the elders? So the disciples had been eating, on the Sabbath, or harvesting grain on the Sabbath. And the religious leaders were unhappy and confronting Jesus about this legal infraction, if you will. Why do your disciples break the traditions of the elders? And then Jesus replies, and this is a little bite, because it's a brief exchange, but it's a very pivotal, very pungent exchange between Jesus and the religious leaders. Jesus' reply says this: why do you yourselves transgress the commandments of God for the sake of your traditions? And I was thinking about this, really I've read this before, but it really resonated with me recently. I was like, it's a contrast between the traditions of man and the commandments of God. And I think we need to ask ourselves if we have any kind of gap in those respective areas, traditions of man. So a tradition of man could be, here and the religious leaders in Jesus' time, they had a lot of traditions of man. Jesus kind of outed them on one of them, where they dishonored their parents by giving gifts to the temple. And Jesus said, hey, you guys are keeping the tradition of man at the expense of the commandment of God. And I think sometimes if we're not careful, we might accidentally fall down into that little trap where we keep traditions of man. We keep religious traditions. So we keep a religious tradition. I remember growing up, we used to always have to get dressed up. And granted, I'm a pastor's kid, so I'm in church every Sunday, which is fine, no problem on that. But I remember, we'd have to dress up and look nice and all that. And then people who came that were less dressy or kind of scroungy, didn't look real good, I would find myself looking down on them. But it was more a tradition of man rather than the commandment of God. And so it's sometimes we have these ideas in our head that are good ideas, but they are human traditions. And I gave you that example. There are some others that I think sometimes we take as super important. We get really amped up on some things that really are just man's traditions. I think Paul, some of the things that he talked about women having their head covered. Well, that's not necessarily a command of God. It's a cultural, historical tradition, a tradition of man, but it's not necessarily a commandment of God. And so I think of late, in our modern world, we don't have as many traditions, but it's something for us to think about. It's a little bite, a little conversation with Jesus for us to consider. Are there some traditions that I hold on to that would be religious traditions? Now, what's the contrast is the commandments of God. Now, you can say, well, God has a lot of commandments, but Jesus boils it down to two. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. So commandments of God really distill into one word, and that's love, genuine love. And I want us to be really conscientious and maybe reflect, take some moments to pause on this and consider, do I accentuate the traditions, religious traditions, at the expense of love? Or do I prioritize love over potential religious traditions? I think it's a really important thing for us to think about, to consider and ask. Is this a challenge for me? Is there a discrepancy in my priorities, in my behaviors, in my conversations? And let's always prioritize love, the commandments of God, even when it's at the expense of religious traditions. There's a really powerful tapas conversation, little bite between Jesus and religious leaders. And so as we finish today, I'd like for you to think about this. What might be some religious traditions that you have experienced? It might be positive or negative, but religious traditions. Just answer that question for me, leave it in the comments. What are some religious traditions that you have experienced? It doesn't have to be long. It might be something simple or just quick, but leave that in your comments. I'd love to read and hear your thoughts on that. And thank you so much for subscribing. Of course, you want to hit that little notification bell right there, because then that keeps you posted when we have new content. And I know you're waiting for this fantastic joke here at the end. Fantastic with dripping sarcasm, right? We know that. So here's your joke. Did you hear about the big Lego sale? There's a huge Lego sale. People were lined up for blocks. Legos, blocks, get it? I know, you're like, rah, rah, rah. Yeah, but next week will be so much better. Thanks again for watching and listening.